Okay, let us do a little elective cognition, this time on a tweet somebody has put forward, um, which has provoked me because it's accusing Heidegger of error, and so we should try to decompose this. But also, I think, because it's of general interest to sort of practice the methodos, or the um, sort of put a new turn in the path a little bit. Don't usually touch on anything by Antonio Negri. Apparently this was written in 2023, or at least it came out in the year that he died. I don't know necessarily when it was written. The tweet only gave one bit from the preference to his book, Potentia. I think the title is Potentia. And the specific citation was, if Heidegger never considered Spinoza as a philosopher who could be considered a part of modern metaphysics, this sectarian underestimation not only deserves no response, but serves as a condemnation of its author. So in other words, if Heidegger has understood Spinoza this way, then all the worse for him. So let's look. So first of all, generally, I think what's wrong, Hart I don't like because I think he's just uneducated, but he gets too many things wrong, and he doesn't know his stuff very well. I think he's mostly popular because he's on the side of the progressives, and there's a built-in audience. He's not that bad, but I just don't. Life is short. It's not as bad as somebody like Richard Wolff or something that just constantly uttered bullshit to the choir, as it were. But there's a little bit of that in just that he's a little bit of an ignoramus. Negri, I don't really know. I haven't read very much of him. The statement, though, their whole tact is sort of, to me, the highest representative of that tact. I'm not saying the progressive tact so much, but of this sort of working with what's left of Marx, as it were, is Lukács. So, and that's it. That's sort of the terminus of that tradition. And then you got other people like Zizek or whoever, but it's sort of, I would say somebody who is actually good and knows their stuff, like a Gembin, would put down this whole avenue of invasion, as it were, as sharpening the knives when there's nothing left to cut. So it's tendentious in that it tries to do something. In one sense, it tries to do something like say, we have a false consciousness due to our current condition in quote-unquote late capitalism. Well, we've been told we're in late capitalism for 70 years. For Richard Wolff's whole career, he's been selling that Wolff tickets to that. Therefore, we have the false consciousness, but we could get the true consciousness through, some kind of Marxist methods. This presupposes, one, that our whole purpose is to solve the human problem by solving the economic problem, and that this is the main avenue of invasion. And that then correspondingly, I mean, in Marx and Engels, there's just sort of like the claim that we put a little more emphasis on the material empirical conditions of the economy and consider them as the origin of our ideas and our structures. And this, in fact, is almost universally accepted. All history is written more or less like this, even by historians who claim to be conservative and claim to hate Marx or despise Marx. Almost all history is sort of written in this materialist fashion. Yeah, I mean, maybe if you go back to already with Will Durant or something, you're already sort of prior to that, even though Will Durant also is part of that, but is sort of has a foot in the older tradition. But I think today, absolutely every historian sort of presents the weight is on the empirical and against something like Plutarch, where you think of the somehow incidents in history as having true and ultimate moral exemplars hidden in them somehow, or some other form of history before history became a profession in the 19th century. Basically, only in the 19th century did history become a profession, and then the problem was who's supervising these historians. In Prussia, of course, it was the House of Hohenzollern, and therefore the histories they wrote were in a certain way tilted, and then the liberals kept harping on, oh, we should do the Wertfreie Wissenschaft, we should be neutral. And finally then, and that was a way of doing politics, because you couldn't write a chauvinistic, nationalistic history for the sake of the country, for the Volk, I guess. The Volk as represented by the Kaiser and his family, and by Bismarck, who wasn't part of the higher nobility. First, the supposed great man, yeah, taken from all that point of view, you get this contest of, oh, but isn't there a scientific way to do history that doesn't involve politics? So you had something that's more or less resembles the debates today about whether the Supreme Court is a political entity or whether it's the law is something like a science that can be applied even-handedly, and if it is, then how do we clean it up somehow? Something like that happened in history, and then people just stopped caring, I think, because university professors put out histories, and then some of them are more acclaimed, like that book on the how is it called, the Indigenous Empire or something like that, which somehow fits the standards of most of the history departments and the American History Society, or however it's called, and some other big institutions. And then it's like, even though it has n number of presuppositions behind it, which and it will obviously be written differently in 50 years, it's sort of hard to find any solid ground to critique it from on the basis of current politics. Yeah, taking into account all this type of problem, I think then we have to say there's just no point in continuing to pursue some kind of Marxist solution. It's stupid. But that's my opinion. But let's try to engage with this anyway. I think so. Then, therefore, we should listen to the people that are more serious, like Agamben and like Heidegger, who have showed this is why our tradition has, fallen into these ditches, such as presentism, which is in a way what I was just describing. And here's the possible ways to get out, instead of continually saying, oh, let's solve this problem that we preconceived as the main problem, the economic problem, and let's try to tweak our interpretation of Spinoza accordingly. But nonetheless, maybe within certain limits we could learn something from that. So let's look at. So I looked at the whole forward from which that was drawn, and there's this funny comment that caught my eye where he's saying Margherita Vespucci's book is easy to read when we follow the Ariadne's thread, which leads our intelligence and potentia into conflict with the capitalist minotaur. So I mean, it would be helpful to get some guidance on this, but I suppose if he's sort of as some editors and as people reading this, he must not. Did he actually make a mistake? And I mean, first of all, Ariadne's thread does not lead to the minotaur. She gives him the clue, CLEW, and she's standing at the door of the maze, and then he goes in and does a backflip or something and kills the minotaur, and then he follows the clue back out. The string doesn't lead to the minotaur. So why did he say that? I don't know. Maybe it's just levity or laxity or something. But we're doing Yalcin and Rosetson and try to face up to it. Maybe he actually means something like that. But let's forget about what actually happens in the myth. Theseus, by the way, is sort of the first democratic hero. He's the hero of. Not that Negri is particularly conscious of this, so far as I can see, but I don't think he is. But among classical scholars, that's sort of a take that's often held, is that Theseus is the first big democratic hero. He's the hero of Athens, in a certain way, the feminine state, the first feminine state, as against the whole of the Hellenes or the Greeks, who, I mean, it's very interesting that the Greeks have this name that's may come from Helios and certainly has to do with sun in the form of Apollo, who are all Apollonian in this sense, supposedly. And the symbol of Greeks being Helios somehow. But Apollo being male and representing all the Greeks, and Athena being female and only being the specific representative of the democratic Greeks in Athens. There may have been, I think there were at least one other democracy beside from Athens at the same time or earlier, but it was it was not very consequential, I don't think. And Theseus is going up against, in modern terms, the autocrat Minos, who, however, was in a way the first thalassocratic master in a certain sense, or represents that. Minos is supposed to have brought down a certain code of laws that he received in the cave of Zeus at the foot of Mount Ida and so on, as we hear about in not actually in Plato's Minos, but in the Nomoi and the Laws, and also in other sources. But that being the case, I mean, I'm not particularly inclined to think the Negarian mentioning this is doing anything else but speaking in a flourish. But what struck me about that passage really is that he says also another thing that's totally crazy by the normal way of talking, is that he says, and it must be intentional, I think, is he says that our intelligence and our potentia come into conflict with the capitalist minotaur. So, I mean, Spinoza, the big thing about Spinoza is he's removed intelligence and will. Or put another way, the person from the Western metaphysics. That wasn't clear in Descartes. Maybe it was already in Descartes in a way, and Spinoza just brought it out in his book, which is called Ethics, though it has no trolley cart problem or anything of the kind, but only sort of an engagement with Descartes' first philosophy. Why it's called Ethics, actually, I do not know. But there we kind of get the thrust of Spinoza's system, and so it's very weird that so obviously Negri is doing something else than going by Spinoza. He's trying to use Spinoza in a new way. So I guess the criticism about Heidegger's reading is to say Heidegger thinks this of Spinoza, but also of Kierkegaard, that they're ontotheological. And with respect to Spinoza, it has to do with that Spinoza is all about necessity and not about anymore like Aristotle, the dunamis or the potentiality. Heidegger thinks this more exactly, I think, in the winter of 3940, I think is the date given for when he gave a lecture, which, however, it doesn't appear in the collected works, on Spinoza. And but he's also mentioned numerous times Spinoza in this connection of favoring necessity. But what else about Spinoza? It seems that Negri, so what is Negri saying? He's saying Heidegger neatly tucks Spinoza into the last people to be dealing with Aristotle in a way, which would include Locke as well, I think. Like Locke is sort of a halfway house where he's sort of trying to reconcile Aristotle to Descartes. Spinoza, of course, Spinoza works primarily directly with Descartes, but he's sort of, that's the way. I guess that's a legitimate in. So it's sort of unclear. Heidegger wants to say, Spinoza is sort of in the line of Aristotelian thinking of substance, maybe in a way connected to the sometimes the original idea of substance is given by hypokaimenon, or as something standing under, which amounts to saying the nature of ta panta, or all things, or possibly in its original sense only kind of the nature of the things we would call nature, in the sense of like the great outdoors, the ocean, the forest, the way they by themselves sort of regenerate themselves to some extent. The stars, as it were, falling in the deep parts of the ocean where schools of fish are been swimming around for millions of years. And this notion of hypokaimenon amongst the first thinkers and amongst the Athenians then being taken as eternal. So the substance thinking rather than the subject thinking Yeah, possibly Heidegger is supposedly placing Spinoza more there. I mean, what does Spinoza actually say? He says the attempts of Descartes to link up the substance to the his new subject, the cogito, are ridiculous and are not at all. They don't follow his own rule of clarity, or I mean, another way to say clarity is probably to say his own interpretation. So then, I mean, it strikes me one way to understand Spinoza is, I mean, Spinoza keeps with the extension and thought, but then he says, oh, but there's, so it's sort of like Ensof, the Kabbalistic notion of Ensof. He says, oh, but there's an infinite number of other things going on in this one substance of the subspecies eternus God, of necessity, this plenum, as it were. I mean, plenum also as an idea that links up to the modern physics too. This absolute plenum of necessity, which is like, yeah, like the Ensof, like the Kabbalistic mystical idea of Ensof. So I think, yes, I can see where there's a lot of room for Negri and these other authors that he's mentioning to try out a lot of things there. But I would say, well, okay, we could spare somebody to do that, but it's not really cogent. I'd rather have, so what happened, I mean, one thing, rather have a more direct look at all the developments that lead up to Nietzsche, and then, yeah, we see the real difficulties that are raging over the earth, because they are raging over the earth, instead of pretending that we're still in the time of Spinoza or some other time. It could do that, but I don't find it particularly compelling. Myself, I think Agamben is good. I think Dugin is good. I don't think these people are doing anything sensible, and also it often shows the fact that they're ignoramuses and make a lot of petty mistakes, which you don't see in Dugin or Agamben, or Heidegger for that matter. The other side of the Spinoza would then, according to what Negri is sort of oddly to me claiming is like well established, well known. How does he say that we could take as a given? I think he says. We could take as a given that Heidegger has this attitude, and that Heidegger is just dispelling Spinoza as a nothing in a backwater. But actually, I think Heidegger says, both of Spinoza and of Kierkegaard, yeah, they're doing something. It's still, like, it's part of the great essencing of the West. We could still contact it, but it has, according to Heidegger, it has this flaw of being of ontotheology. And so Heidegger says, like, for instance, the Reigness in the full sense, Heidegger himself first tries to lay out in the form of Dasein, and it's sort of a failure, because he lays out Dasein only to deconstruct it in Kantian. So Kantian would already be past Spinoza, according to this Negri's version, where he's saying, oh, Heidegger is classing Spinoza back with the substance people and not even with the transcendental substance of the German idealism. And therefore, he's not even at Zizek's level. Heidegger is so much demoting Spinoza that we rightfully can put down Heidegger as a fool, or at least sort of discount him to an extreme extent, more than half off Heidegger. We have, but I think Heidegger is saying something specific, which is that, first he tries to deconstruct the Dasein, but then he says Ereignis is another way. So the point is, Spinoza is fixing us in a way dogmatically on something that doesn't seem to be directly cogent, which is this whole claim about the necessity of the sort of Ein Sof or infinite aspects of being understood as, it so happens that we only have access to the cognito ergo, the I think therefore I am, cognito ergo sum, and the extension, which somewhat confusingly, I mean, in Descartes, I think Descartes really wants to say the extension is maintained sheerly intellectually through intellectual proofs, which are similar to the proofs Spinoza accepts and Thomas accepts about geometry. But then later on, it kind of seems people like Bishop Berkeley, come in and say, aren't these people like Descartes making a mistake, because actually empirically extension is no more vouched for and reliable than any of the other so-called how did they call it, the primary qualities. It's like solidity. I mean, that's a long story, but in any case, I think we do get, it is possible to do what Negri's doing, but I think it's tendentious because he's trying to solve specific problems which are kind of like it probably leads us away from saying what the actual case is with being. It probably, because we presuppose that we presuppose this is the way to solve the human problem through this economic avenue of incursion. But why do we have to do that? Maybe if we actually do phenomenology and investigate directly, then we could leave that presupposition behind. And that seems to be much more cogent when we look at the authors who have followed that path. And but let me say one other thing. This is actually, there's another factor, which is what is taught in the university. So there's the Spinoza-ismus right, which is also called the pantheismus right, and through it intelligence and will were evacuated from the official account of knowledge in all the universities. Maybe not so much in Oxford and Cambridge, but in the German universities. I don't know. And then you have like the wild card in a way with the Edinburgh. But generally speaking, we can see that all of us today think more in the terms of the denial of looking at nature as being in some way intelligent, which it doesn't actually make sense, except that you would, it's radically self-destructive. In Kant's phrase, the judge, and the judge turned out not to be a wise judge. So meaning, it turns out we think we're intelligent and we're making an intelligent inquiry into the nature of things, but it so turns out intelligence isn't something that exists in nature at all. So then, therefore, yeah, we're in a bad way. But then we tried to solve that by dialing back and just looking at the so-called natural sciences, which have also given way because physics, there's so much nonsense in physics, and I think maybe I'm wrong, but my impression is the term STEM is like the most prevalent thing in the universities today, like science, technology, engineering, math, which sort of doesn't really conform to any particular theory of any kind, or nobody's really putting that forward, unless it's some idiot like Sam Harris. But it's more like that just seems like that people are into those things, into the hard sciences, into engineering, and so I guess that's another reason why I would say Heidegger makes more sense here, in that unlike Marx, who's thinking about the economy and thinking about liberalism, and maybe Dugin falls into this trap too, to some extent, maybe not, but and I feel like kind of guilty conscious of going too far in that direction myself, of looking at liberalism and economics too much and not enough at the obvious, which is that if STEM is the core that indicates that accelerationism is the real belief of the society, and accelerationism is about the cybernetic essence or the technological essence, and again, as sometimes I've mentioned, that means exactly in its greatest current manifestation all the sort of the claim of a rational market hypothesis, demonstrating that it's the most efficient outlay of our resources as beings is into the artificial intelligence, which, however, I mean, it seems to me all we can see from our current horizon is something like, I think they got it exactly in the Ridley Scott film, in the Raised by Wolves, where they had that AI machine tasking people and saying, this is the most efficient way to spend your day, do this, do this, do this. Because there's sort of like on a desolate planet somewhere where there's no pre-existing sort of habits of how people should, there's no street with people opening shops or something. They're just out there, and then the AI seems legitimately to know more about how to do things than any individuals do, since usually, I mean, so much of that stuff is kind of in the memory of the institutions, but they're on a planet in the middle of nowhere. So that's, in a way, it's a good metaphor for the gambit, I guess, with putting everything into AI. AI doesn't know that the world is a familiar place to human beings in some sense, or doesn't know that there's habits and ways of doing things. It can radically just say, try this, try that, and then task people to theorize about it and do engineering on it and do STEM on it. I think in that way Heidegger's claim that we have to negotiate into existence with the technological essence must make more sense than sort of the I regard it somewhat as fanciful, the continued Marxist sorties, sort of, and also that guy that I sometimes I forget what his name is, that does I don't know, it's not for the, maybe for, is it for the new school, I don't know, a guy that's always talking about the people list, the people that I mean, he might as well be talking about das Volk. He might as well be talking about comrades or something like that. I mean, Mussolini was also thinking about the people. Mussolini was also I mean, these are not the best. I mean, the notion, all these kinds of notions swirling up now because Donnie has come into New York and he's promising to make these supermarkets, and then people are recommending, oh, but it should be under local control and it has to be insulated against in case a new government comes and the next mayor comes in and gets rid of it or something. No, it has to be somehow co-ops under, as if all this hadn't been the ambition of the people that we in certain cases regard as the most wicked people in former times. No, it's all a mess that way, and I think the more just from a pragmatic, from any perspective, from every perspective, it's the Gambin and Heidegger show more intelligence here and show more of a thorough and serious appraisal of the situation.